I've been grappling with how to address these issues as a black male myself and the father of two beautiful girls. As superintendent, I constantly think about ways to keep our schools safe and to ensure education is the great equalizer. As I grapple with these very serious issues, I thought it might be helpful to also chat with Dr. Yaeger and Mr. Lopez, because you two are very vested and have the interests of our children, and because your experiences as members of a racially ethnic group gives you a unique perspective to think about these ideas. I'm hoping that our dialogue today can generate much needed dialogue on injustice, oppression, racism, and how we as a district make it better. So my first question, I'm wondering if you could share a moment of time when you either experienced an injustice yourself or a time when you first became aware that your race or ethnicity was perceived as different. We'll start with you, Mr. Lopez.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Foust, and thank you, Dr. Yaeger, for this really important conversation in light of everything that's been happening in our country recently, highlighting a lot of the inequities, injustice, racial injustices that continue to perpetuate and impact our communities. It's important for us to have this conversation, to really be thoughtful about not only our words, but our actions and what's to follow. And so I appreciate the time to have a conversation and look forward to bringing other folks into the conversation and seeing what we as a district can continue to do to keep our, particularly our Black and brown boys and community safe. So thank you for this opportunity. I think, you know, you ask around times when we've seen or faced racism or discrimination in our own lives. And you know, I don't want to pick on one particular time, but I remember, you know, in high school, I was a part of this camp called Anytown, which really talked on these issues of racism, sexism, and you know, all the isms you can think of, and how all of us are impacted by the systemic racism and discrimination that exists in our community and in our country. So I think that really helped open my eyes in terms of that this impacts all of us, and we can't just stand on the sideline and not participate in improving what our communities look like. So I think that's something I vividly remember my experience in that camp and with my campmates talking about and crying with my Black and brown brothers and sisters and my white brothers and sisters, thinking about how we've all been impacted by racism and social injustices in this community. And so as we look at what's happening now, I can't help but just feel hurt and sadness for everything that's going on. But I also want to find hope in that we can do better, and it's past time to do better.
I think in my experience, it was in elementary school. One thing about growing up, I grew up going to Hawthorne Carruthers is what it's named now. And there was a lot of Black teachers that I had growing up. And one particular instance was show and tell. And my mom and dad was trying to debate which toy I was going to take. And I remember them really advocating for me to take one of my Black dolls to school. And my mom was concerned that my classmates wouldn't receive it the same way. And so I ended up taking my favorite Barbie doll, who looked just like me, to school. And one of the classmates called that ugly. And it really hurt to my core. And that was the first instance I really started to realize what's wrong, you know, and thought about race. As I moved into high school, I had lots of friends, and one of my friends lived in a neighboring town. I remember going there, and the clerk called us colored. They said there's a group of colored girls that just walked in the store and announced it over the intercom. That was the first time I'd experienced something like that. It was a neighboring town. I wasn't familiar with it. And immediately I said, let's go. But my friend, because she was from that town, was used to it. And I think that opened the dialogue between race relations and how we can work together to when someone may not feel comfortable and other people are comfortable with it. Sometimes in the communities, we have a division for people who are not familiar with racism, because there's many of our black and brown people who have not experienced racism. And there are many who've not seen racism up close. So when we think about how we can work together and bring things, it's to value that experience, whether it's recorded or not, that everyone has the ability to be heard, and that if there is some offense related to that, to be understanding and to be able to talk through it rather than feel like, oh, it's no big deal.
I distinctly remember, it was October of 2010. I'd moved to Houston that July, and I was on my way home. And so it was in traffic around about 6 o'clock. And going up the highway, headed home. And I mean, the traffic in Houston is a little different. It's like it's bumper to bumper on the highway. Even though you're on the highway, you're going maybe 35, 40 miles an hour. And I remember a state trooper getting behind me, and I was pulled over. And so when they pulled over, I kind of pulled into a little area because I had to work my way to get off the highway because it's 6 lanes of traffic. And so I got over. And I was like, well, I knew that I was not, I wasn't speeding. I knew, I was just trying to figure out why were they pulling me over. And so he said that I was tailgating. And so I turned, and it was immediately, I turned and I pointed at the cars. I'm like, everyone's in bumper to bumper traffic. He says, no, you were tailgating. And I was like, but you were behind me. And at that point, I had never, ever found that, I'd always heard of the racially profiling and those types of things, but I'd never lived it. And so, of course, I gave my driver's license, insurance, all those things. And then I even had my badge, and I said, I'm a principal. And he came back and said, well, I'm going to give you a warning, but I need for you to stay 6 car lengths apart. And so I asked, I said, so how do you expect to manage that? Because I'm seeing all of these other cars, and they're not 6. He said, but I need for you to stay 6 car lengths. And so I sat there for a minute as he went off, and I was just thinking, now, all of these cars are going, and no one in bumper-to-bumper traffic is 6 car lengths. And, I mean, I can actually tell you, I even remember what I had on that day. That's how much of an impression it made on me. And I kept that. I kept that warning for some years to remind me that it matters not your job. It matters not what you look like. It matters not how you're dressed. Literally shirt and tie. It matters not, who you are. It's just the profile. I was an African-American male in this car. And I was pulled over and given a warning, and actually given a stern talking to about why you should not tailgate. And so I just, to this day, I still deal with that and become a little angst when I see state troopers or on the highway, and I'm thinking, why do I get this way? You have a doctoral degree. You have a honest job, but even when the sirens go off, I still think, is it me? So those are the things where I think that's the one that I think, and there have been other times that I could, but that was the one that's most vivid. And I know how to deal with it on my level, but I often am fearful for individuals who don't have the coping skills that I sometimes have, and sometimes that doesn't even work either, because it just depends. And so that's the fear or the anxiety. I don't know if it's fear, the anxiety that builds up for me when I actually see the the lights. So, how does that memory and that confusion and frustration do to this current racial unrest make you feel? So I know you had spoken about your time that you had with any town, but how does it make you feel? How does this current state, this frustration, how does it make you feel?
I think as I think about my experiences that I've had and that others close to me have had or that I've seen in community, and particularly, the murders that we just saw of George Floyd and of others, name any feeling, any emotion, and that's what runs through you. Hurt, sadness, anger, just unsure, uncertain. And then you see some of the rallies that people are coming together and standing up for one another, and then you start feeling hopeful, start feeling optimistic. But I think I think we have to sit with those initial feelings of anger and hurt and sadness and confusion, but of clarity, of knowing that this isn't new. You mentioned your experience. Dr. Yaeger mentioned her experience. Everyone can point to different experiences that we've had in our community. This is nothing new for any of us. And we all experience these things in some form or fashion. They show up in our lives. And so for that, like when I think about what's happening right now, the heaviness of life right now, sometimes it's hard. It's really difficult to put into words sometimes what you feel. But I think most days recently I've just been feeling hurt and lost for words and just heavy because of the gravity of it all. And I think about my own experiences and as you asked, it's hard to believe that we're in this space still. I think back on the words of James Baldwin, a great American writer, and he talked about how, he just wants to live his life in peace. He said, I'm a proud black man who just wants to live my life in peace, who wants to walk in the stores without being racially profiled, doesn't want to have that double standard, wants to have conversations with people, with police officers without them taking out their guns. And then to think about the stuff that we're living now, how heavy and how hurtful that is. And I think about from a district perspective, what that means for our students and our kids and what they're having to live through and see now. It's hard. So I think we have to sit in those feelings, those emotions, those raw emotions that we have, because they're very real and we can't dismiss them for any of us. But I think we're seeing how that's bringing our community hopefully closer together with the rallies and the folks coming together. To me, that brings some hope and some optimism as well, to know that, man, there's some really amazing people out there fighting for justice, fighting for equity, and I want us as a district to be part of that.
Wow. What about you? Does it cause any your confusion or your frustration from?
Right. Well, being in education, it's caused me to do self-reflection and how we can help advocate before things like this continue to happen, because now we're getting the resources posted. Now we're talking about therapy and mental health and how we can reach out and talk through those emotions. And so it was very hurtful to me because it keeps happening in our community. Although we see it, sometime distance, we were on the national news for the way a citizen was treated here in our local area. So we can feel that it's so far removed that it doesn't have an impact. Also, there was a number of graduations in which our students passed away. And that was hurtful to me.
It's heavy.
It's hard. Because it comes from all angles. And so what I see myself as doing is being that advocate.
Right.
So they can see me and know we have options.
Absolutely.
Thank you. When we, as leaders, show our children that it's an option for us to live here in Kansas City, Kansas. It's an option for you to want to do better. It's an option to strive for more. I do have a PhD, and I choose to live here in Kansas City, Kansas. I could live other places, but I chose here because my goal is to give back. So if we learn nothing else, is to keep striving for the best.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that, I think both of you used a verb that, how I felt when in any of this frustration, confusion, the hurt. That's what it is. I think it's more hurt because I think you said it earlier, that this has been happening, and our voices were somewhat muted, and so now it's getting attention. But again, we think about in all the others and how it affected us, and is this an outcry of being fed up? I often I would say Fannie Lou Hamer when she says, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so I think this is where America has come. They're just sick and tired of being sick and tired because the amount of the weight that this carries on us, the amount of pressure, the social, emotional portion, the sleepless nights that it has weighed, because we all can name one person that, whether it was us or whether it was an individual that we know that something has happened to them. So I get it, and I use that term. I don't use it loosely. I get it. I understand. I'd like for each of you to tell me what went through your mind the moment you saw the video. And if we want to start with you, Mr. Lopez.
Yeah, man, that's I don't think there's any words to describe, what you feel when I first saw that video. There's to witness that on video, to witness someone crying out for help in that way. There's really nothing. There's really nothing to describe how you can feel that will that's appropriate for that. It's shocked, disgusted, angry, sad, hurt. Again, all those raw emotions that come through were, yeah, it was just awful to see that, to see another human being taking the life of an innocent man laying there helpless, calling for his mother. It's nothing anybody should ever have to see or witness or be a part of. And yet we still continue to question whether racism, police brutality, injustice, hate exists in this world. And that is beyond me. Sorry, I'm just at a loss for words with that. When you bring up that video, it's just, and there's just so much that comes with it.
Right. And I would agree. I could not get through the whole video. And the question I had is, if I was there, what could I have done? What could I have done? I started watching it and I said, I can't even do it. My daughter's a teenager. She's in high school. She watched it herself because it was a discussion amongst her peers. And she said, Mom, what could I have done to prevent it? The frustration, the disappointment, the questions about what happens when we come across a police officer who happens to be bad? What do we do? And so, with all the emotions, as Randy said, were reflected in me, but my thought at the end, when we had a discussion, is what can we do? What could those people have done watching the despair, calling out for their mom, calling out for somebody to step in? And I quite thought about our educational system, Dr. Foust, because many of our students cry out to us and say, I just want to read.
Right.
I just want an education. Right. What are we doing? Because in that community, it was a black and brown community. The cashier who thought the bill was fake and called the police, there's something going on with that, and there's just a lot more behind it for us to see. When our kids are crying out for help, are we there to help? And so, although a lot of emotions revolved about the video, it was, what can we do now? How do we move forward? How can we help the children who are crying out daily to avoid that the prison pipeline of not being able to read? What do we do? And so many emotions, and my family is such a problem solver. My daughter said, what are we going to do? So, yeah, I can't, the video, like I said, words can't even, I can't even express the emotions I felt at that time.
So I had to watch it by myself. And to this day, it's still, I still see it as if I were literally on the street. I see that, not knowing the effect that it would have on me. I shared the conversation with a colleague, for an adult to call for their mom in despair, knowing, I think the word, what they were saying is that the mother had passed away, but everyone knows that when you call for your mom, she will bust down any door, anything to get to her child when she hears the pain in the voice. And so I was dealing with the fact of they would not get off of his throat. They would not get off of him. And it didn't matter when he told them he could not breathe. They would not stop. When he said, hey, I'm going to die, they would not stop. So I was thinking, hey, it's like, what if that were Charles? And what if Charles was saying, I can't breathe, can you? And they would, what do? You call for your mom, help me. No one was helping him. And so I still struggle, and this is the first time I'm able to get through this conversation, so I guess I'm making some waves in it, but I struggle with just the fact that how was someone able to literally choke the life out of someone? That hurt. I don't know what the issue was. Of course, I can't create a scene, but what I do know is this: it feels really, really disjointed for me to know that, and I can say this as a black man, that someone could ultimately take my life in front of people. I could have a family, or I have a family, and that's all I kept doing, is putting myself in his and thinking, I have daughters. What if that were me? What would I do? And it's what can we do? That's honestly, because before the protesting, my thought was, well, what's going to happen because nothing has happened in the past. And I just didn't understand. So I would say, how did I feel? What went through my mind? I don't understand. And it matters not how educated you are. There are just some things that don't make sense. And that was something to me that did not make sense. And I can't explain it. And those are like, it's not that words, I just can't explain it. So just for conversations about the race and racial injustices are difficult for people to have. We know that when you're having a conversation. Some people are labeled as troublemakers. Others are hushed. And some adopt a colorblinded perspective in an environment where being too political. What do we gain by being intentional to talk about race? What do we gain about being intentional? And so I will, let's reverse it. I'll start with you, Dr. Yaeger.
The one thing we are intentional by talking about race is putting it on the table. I am in an interracial relationship, and prior to getting married, we talked about racial relations. And it's important to know where people stand. One thing that's really important is that you have to, when you are talking about issues, and whether you feel like it's radical or a troublemaker, the other person has to be willing to listen and understand. Although people look different, they can have the same values. When we went protesting downtown, we were protesting together. When we went protesting or advocating, we were saying Black Lives Matter. It's important that we talk about these things. And sometimes, family members who may not understand will say, well, why not all lives instead of just Black lives? That's a common conversation because we do have kids from both races. And how it's explained is simply this: all lives do matter. However, right now we're focusing on the Black lives that were taken by senseless violence against them, and which happen to be by police officers. And so why are we focusing on this? Because that is what is the common theme between the people we are advocating for. It's not to take away from other races. It's not to take away from other abuses of power that some authority figures may have or police may have. But in this instance, it was a Black man who was killed by a police officer. In Breonna's instance, today's her birthday, she was killed by a Black officer. Not only that, her boyfriend was arrested when he shot the police officer. And and so there's many instances to where we have to mold the difference between the police officers that are served to protect and our Black and brown communities. And so when we talk about race relations, it's to put it out there. We do not teach colorblind. We do not teach our kids to say, well, we're colorblind. No, we see color, but that will not determine how I treat you, how I act towards you, my beliefs towards you. We do see color. So it's important to have those conversations about why it could be offensive when people says, well, I don't see color, or you're a different Black person. That's very offensive, but it's important to talk about it. Because when we don't, that's when we allow the assumptions to take place and really can't address the issues that continue to happen between the race relations.
So, what about you, Mr. Lopez? And definitely, we want to hear, the intentions. What can you add more?
Yeah, I think something Dr. Yaeger mentioned about just being very intentional about saying it. And right now we hear people asking, say George Floyd's name, say Black Lives Matter. People are sometimes afraid and hesitant to say these things and to talk about race But I think it's important that we, as Dr. Yaeger said, put it on the table and actually acknowledge that these things are important and that race is a part of who we are. And you're absolutely right. You know, I've had several people tell me, well, I don't see color. I don't see your color. Well, then you don't see me, right? You don't see, because that is a part of who I am, my traditions, my culture, my background. This is who I am. And if you don't see that, then you don't see the whole me. So I think it's important that we acknowledge it and have these real conversations. People get uncomfortable and people get squeamish or want to change the subject. And I think it's okay to sit in that uncomfort or discomfort for a little bit, right? And to have those awkward silences when we ask someone a tough question about race or whatnot. And I think we have to learn to do that. I think we've been taught that that's not something we ask. That's not something we should talk about. But I think that's a part of the systemic oppression that exists in our communities to continue to oppress our Black and brown communities. Just to say it plainly. And then I think it's also very intentional for us to talk about. I think Dr. Yaeger referenced it, just different communities in solidarity, and so when I think about our Black and brown community, the Latinx community and the African American community, and how we have to come together to resolve a lot of these issues, and we have to acknowledge that these things exist, that Black lives do matter, that we still have kids in cages at the border and in our community, that we still have people being deported because of certain status, that police are looking for and targeting young Black men because they look a certain way. So we have to be able to acknowledge these things and talk about them in order to find ways and solutions to these issues. I think another tool that is used in oppression is to divide, right? And so those with power and in control want to use that divisive nature to divide Black and brown communities. Hey, if they can't come together, then that's that they're not as powerful, right? Or even within communities, if we can divide the Latino community, divide the African American community amongst themselves, that's a tool of the oppressor as well. And so we have to recognize it, say it, acknowledge it, and then find solutions to overcome these issues.
There's a long history of mistrust between Black and brown communities and law enforcement. We know that not all cops are bad, but we also know that not all Black and brown people are bad. What will it take for us to cultivate a genuine and authentic desire for racial equity?
I think what we can do is truly allow more conversations and dialogue. Mm-hmm. Also, I think we've done a great job of trying to grow your own. Mm-hmm. We have the OK program here in which students get to interact with law enforcement and do activities together and get to know each other. I think it's so important as we think about how it has an impact on our children, on us, there needs to be more of a working relationship between the two mm-hmm. areas. That way, it's not so, how my dad would put it, it's not so frightening if a cop pulls me over and sees my face, that he doesn't automatically, or she doesn't automatically grab his or her gun and have it ready to shoot. It comes with the comfort of being able to not feel threatened because of what you look like when you're pulled over or when you're followed in the store or when you're accused. It comes from more dialogue. What I see is us trying to help advocate, as we've done in the past, with more community and businesses to help empower our children to think of going into law enforcement, to social justice, political science, so that, as Randy mentioned, so that we can share the wealth within the community. It's always concerning whenever there's a police force that does not represent the community. Mm-hmm. It's always concerned when there's law enforcement or judges or elected officials mm-hmm. who does not reflect the diversity of the community. And I think as a goal, we should strive to continue to help educate in that area and also to help grow more within the community to be comfortable enough to run for office, to go and vote, and to help with that empowerment. I think that would help with the racial injustices.
Yeah, I think, as you were asking that, Dr. Foust, I was thinking about our school district and our very diverse population. And Wyandotte County as a whole is a very diverse community, right? One of the most diverse in the country. And our district is definitely a reflection of that. And I think about, what could we be doing within our own community at the district to improve some of those relationships? And I think Dr. Yaeger's right. It is a lot around communication and how do we improve the communication and the relationships and trust. And that's not going to happen overnight. But I think we've got to take those steps to find ways to build that trust. And we have our police on campus, and so how do we continue to improve those relationships between our police officers and our students? What does that look like when we bring our young people and their families with our police officers and have honest, raw conversations about some of the distrust and how we can overcome that, and taking small steps towards that, to be able to talk to our students and let them feel like that they do have a voice and that they can be heard, and allow them to come up with some solutions that on how to build on those relationships. But I think, we have some really great resources here to expose our students to different fields, especially in the public service sector. And I think, we need to continue to do our part to improve that relationship between we have a community here where we can work with our own police officers, and I know they get the training around mental health, they get the trauma training as well, and so all of these things, cultural awareness training, and it's all ongoing so that we can have better relationships, working relationships with our students and their families and our overall community. And I think when we're invested in our communities, when we live and work and see our neighbors as our own, right? And when we get to know people, it just creates a whole different dynamic and culture. And so I think we can do that on a small scale here that will affect 23,000 students and their families, and we have an obligation to do that.
It's unique because I think in order to cultivate it, we've got to get to know one another. I think sometimes society lives off of stereotypes, and just because you are this color, that's who you are. But it's almost like I want to do a hashtag, do you know me? Because oftentimes the barriers are broken once you sit down and have a conversation. If I have a conversation with you, then it's like, that's not how she is. If I have a conversation with you, that's not how he is. We don't know one another. And I think that's what's the scariness, if I say, because a lot of these killings are African American men. And so in history, people have been fearful of African American men, their stature, their tone. But the question is, do you know me? And I go back to, as you know, George Floyd. How tall was he? He was 6 foot something. But everyone talked to him about as a gentle giant, and they were applying all of this force. And again, I don't know what was preceded all of this, but the guy was calling for his mom. And so when we think about how do we cultivate it, we have to get to know one another. We have to be able to sit down at the table and have those racial talks. We have to sit down and talk about, what is the issue with us versus them, or them versus us, or us versus us. Because until we figure it out ourselves, people are going to continue to define who we are and what we're supposed to do. And I just want people to understand that, as a black man, we come in different shades, different heights, different sizes. Our impact is different, just like anyone else. And so we have to be able to literally get to know one another. And so, we talk about the killings of unarmed black men. The discussion oftentimes centers around men. But we know that black women and black transgender individuals are also killed. How can we ensure that their voice is also included in this important conversation? How do we make sure that it's just not, one gender? How do we make sure that all voices are included?
Well, I think it's just to continue to say their name, like Sandra Bland, another Texas incident, pulled over, etc. I think it's important to say their name. Don't be afraid to look at the list of women as well, because this week I did post a list of women. Don't forget about the women who have died at the hands of police. And it's unfortunate that many people do not know about them or their name or their story. And as you say their name and who they are, people are able to look them up and talk about them. Right. And even in the classroom, we should be proud to have that diversity in our classrooms to talk about the different races and the struggles and the concerns that goes on into the community. And I expect when we start school again this fall, it will be part of that conversation, because again, when you are around so much brutality or killings or deaths, that's traumatic. That's PTSD. And as we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they have to feel safe. They have to feel wanted. They have to know that it's okay to talk through those emotions. Even as a person who's a professional and went to work every day this week and had conference calls, a lot of it centered around, what do we do for the students? What do we do for the staff? How can we talk to the students? How can we talk to the staff? And surprisingly, no one complained that it was summer break. No one complained that we were having these pocket conversations, because it was needed, because people were hurting.
So what about Ms. Lopez?
Yeah, I just think, again, as making sure that they stay in our, that all communities, all genders stay top of mind. And you're absolutely right. All are impacted. And that we understand that, we can speak it, say it. And I know June is Pride Month, and I know the LGBTQ community has already come out and said, hey, we stand in solidarity with our Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think just understanding and being able to say it, vocalize it, and share that makes it very real, and it helps us to continue to understand that, yes, this impacts everyone, Black men, Black women, and Black LGBTQ community as well.
Mm-hmm. So, too often our society views social problems individually. I'm asking, what did a person do to deserve their specific condition? But we recognize that history, policies, culture, and many other factors are at play. In a perfect world, what would a school district in a utopian society be like? And so this is two-part. What would prioritize to ensure racial equity? So to utopian school district, and what would be your priority if we give you like two things that you would prioritize?
Right. Well, in my mind, and I reached out to Matt as we were going through choosing a textbook, thinking about what publishers to use, I asked, is there diversity represented in our textbooks? Mm-hmm. We have to remember that when we have images or stories or things that we're asking kids to do, it has to be racially balanced. Mm-hmm. It has to reflect the names of different cultures and not just one area. So what could that look like? That could look like us making sure it's represented in our textbooks, making sure we have that continual dialogue, and training. We have great training right now, and I think ongoing training for cultural diversity, inclusion, equity. We need to continue to have that conversations and then do check-ins. I noticed a lot of teachers posted on Facebook different thoughts and messages and feelings so that their students could see that they matter. Right. And I think it's so important for our teachers to feel comfortable in having conversations or discussions and recognizing, hey, something's not right, maybe something's happened, and address it. while providing them with the resources that students need and they need for themselves to continue to get the training or help they need for that nice utopia.
So, what about you, Lopez?
I think one thing, and it's always a little controversial when you talk about the funding formula, right? So how do we fund our schools? How do we adequately and equitably fund our schools? A lot of times, urban school districts, very much like Kansas City, Kansas, we just don't have the funding to provide our students and staff with everything that we would love to in order to provide the best education. And we're competing with other school districts that have more money. So until, not that money's the going to solve all the issues, but we're so underfunded as a school district. And we need to, if we could figure out how to fund our school districts adequately and equitably, we could find that curriculum and update our curriculum more often. We be able to go out and pay our teachers and hire staff that was reflective of our community. We could have all of those after-school programs and in-school programs and scholarships for our students and all of these things that we want to provide that we're just not adequately funded to do right now. So again, not that it comes down to money, and that would solve all of our issues, but we're off to a bad start, right? So it's when we're not equitably funded, we're not adequately funded, we're already behind in the race, I guess. And so if we could do that better, and I know that's always a controversial topic when we talk about funding for schools in the states, right? And property taxes and all of that kind of stuff. But that would go a long way in our education and making sure that we have what we want to have for our students.
But we were saying this is your utopian society, so it works. So racism shows up in our lives across institutions and society. That is evident in the recent travesty that has taken fold in our nation over the past 2 weeks, not just with George Floyd, but the list of, it unfortunately it just goes on and on and on. That's why it's important for us to continue to have conversations like this one. I want to thank you both for joining me. And it's great to have this type of discussion, and I think we need to have more discussions, because what we were talking about earlier is having that opportunity to get to know, because everyone has a story, and I think we forget that everyone comes with a story. It's almost like, with the airport, you have baggage.
Right.
And so they'll tell you, check your baggage. All too often, we are checking ourselves, say, no, I can't bring that on, I can't take that, can't do this, I'm getting fined for this. But sometimes we just need to unpack it. And I think when we start to unpack, people get to know one another. And I think to be better people, we have to stop and start listening and stop wanting to fix the problem, but listen to them first, and then find out what direction or what do we need to do to help individuals. So again, I want to thank both of you, Dr. Yaeger and Mr. Lopez, for joining me in a conversation, an intro conversation to talk about, our concerns. And I know that we as a unit can create a powerful force for our school district. So again, I want to thank you so much for your time and just for your emotions, because it has literally helped our district. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Foust. Thank you, Dr. Yaeger.